She risked everything to save a bear, but then noticed movement in her belly. The ground trembled beneath her boots. Ivy dropped to her knees, feeling the sharp bite of gravel through her pants as the edge of the canyon cracked a foot closer. Dust plumed into the autumn air, gold and gray, and choking below, the river shimmered like cold steel, slicing the canyon in half with the silent certainty of something ancient. Dangling just over the edge, clinging by one trembling paw to a fractured root, was a black bear, bloody, pregnant, and barely breathing. Her hind legs scraped uselessly at the cliffside, her fur matted with dried mud and deep lacerations, her body sagging from the effort of simply holding on. But it wasn't just the bear struggle that froze Ivy's breath, it was her silence. No roar, no cry, just eyes, huge, black, and locked on Ivy's face, pleading without panic, as if she had already accepted her fate but was willing to believe in something different just once. Ivy leaned farther out, blood already trickling from her knuckles as she gripped the sharp rock. Her fingers burned from holding the ledge, but she didn't care. She wasn't thinking about the fall or the pain or the roaring wind trying to push her back. She was thinking about the bear, not a beast, not an accident of nature, a mother. Ivy's gaze fell to the bear's belly, low and swollen, visibly moving. Ivy felt her throat catch. This bear wasn't just dying, she was carrying lives, lives that had never seen daylight, never breathed autumn air, never touched pine needles or tasted river mist. And someone had left her here to disappear into the canyon. Someone had planned for her to vanish. "I've got you," Ivy whispered, her voice a tremor. "Just hold on." With one arm braced to the earth, Ivy reached the other down, stretching until her shoulder screamed. The bear didn't flinch. She didn't snarl or writhe. She lifted her head just slightly and pressed it against Ivy's forearm. Her breath shivered out in a hot burst. That was trust, not born but given. Ivy gritted her teeth, pulled with everything she had, muscle, memory, will. The cliff crumbled beneath her, a shelf of earth breaking away with a roar. For a moment, both of them hung in the balance, suspended between air and stone. Then Ivy screamed through clenched teeth and heaved inch by inch. The bear's body came up, scraped, torn, and impossibly heavy. With one final burst, Ivy threw her weight backward, and the bear came with her, collapsing into the brittle grass like a felled tree. The bear didn't move. She lay still, chest rising in shallow waves. Ivy crawled to her, brushing debris from the thick fur. No collar, no wildlife tracker, just scars, too straight, too clean, too human. And something else, on her right ear, folded close to her head, was a metal tag, small and stained, its corners scratched. Ivy leaned in. The markings were faint but clearly not meant for wildlife conservation. They didn't belong here. Noted like this. The forest was silent now. Too silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of breath, hers and the bear's. Ivy stared down at the creature, her heartbeat loud in her ears. She had trained to save lives in war zones, had seen enough blood and fire to harden most of her instincts. But nothing had prepared her for this moment, a wild bear, marked and broken, still carrying the future in her womb, still believing somehow that someone would come. Ivy looked at the trail behind her, barely a trace in the underbrush, and whispered to herself, "You weren't supposed to be found, were you?" She knelt again, placed a trembling hand on the bear's side, and felt a kick, small, insistent, defiant. Ivy didn't move for a long time. Then she rose, wrapped her arms beneath the bear's front legs, and began to drag her toward the trees. There was no plan, just purpose. The bear didn't resist the drag. Her body was limp, too exhausted to fight, but she stayed conscious, her breath rasping steadily in and out as Ivy pulled her inch by inch through the undergrowth. The climb from the canyon had taken everything, and still, the forest trail ahead stretched like a test. Ivy's legs shook with every step, but she didn't stop, not when the sun dipped lower behind the pines, not when the shadows turned sharp and cold. She just kept going, one hand on the bear's matted fur, one step at a time, until her cabin finally came into view, tucked between two redwoods, faded wood and tin roof dappled with moss in the slow gold of autumn light. It was more of an outpost than home, but tonight it would be a sanctuary. Inside, Ivy cleared the old woven rug beside the fireplace and laid down thick towels, then covered them with a folded wool blanket. She doubled it over, soft enough to hold weight, thick enough to hold warmth. When she returned to the porch, the bear had not moved from where she'd left her, beneath the awning or curled in half-shock beneath the steps. Ivy crouched low, met the animal's eyes again, and whispered, "Just a little farther, all right?" Then, with a grunt and a final push, she guided her across the threshold. The moment the bear crossed into the cabin, something shifted. She blinked slowly, lifted her nose, and sniffed the air, not alarmed, not aggressive, just aware. Her head tilted toward the fire. And when Ivy lowered her onto the blanket, the bear didn't flinch. She simply let her body rest as if it had finally found something that wasn't trying to take from her. Ivy moved quietly, warm water in a steel bowl, a clean towel, a syringe with diluted electrolytes from her first aid kit. The bear's fur was thick, coarse, and tangled with dried blood and burrs. Ivy worked slowly, starting at the paws. Every few minutes she paused, watching for a sign of distress, but the bear didn't pull away. If anything, she leaned slightly into the pressure, her eyes closing with each stroke. There were no visible signs of recent traps or gunshot wounds, no tracking collars, but there was bruising, deep, symmetrical bruising around the hind legs and spine. 2 deliberate restraints. Ivy had seen marks like these before, though never on an animal. Her hands paused at the bear's side. Something darker was beginning to take shape in her mind. The tag on the ear wasn't from any conservation registry she recognized. The material was wrong. The engraving, nearly worn smooth, didn't list park ID or medical history. It was a cold, functional marking, not monitoring. And then Ivy remembered the whisper in her own head, the gut feeling that had pulled her toward that forgotten trail. The bear hadn't fallen. She'd been thrown away. That night Ivy sat across the room, too wired to rest. The bear slept, chest rising and falling in shallow rhythms, her body curled into itself like she had once known cages. Ivy didn't speak. She just watched. Outside, the forest wind sighed against the walls, branches creaking like bones, but inside the silence felt different, not empty, not alone. It had been 9 months since Ivy had come back from her last tour, longer since she'd stopped trying to explain to anyone what war really did. She had chosen the wilderness, not for its beauty, but for its silence, because the noise inside her never stopped. But now, looking at this bear, this battered breathing creature who had carried life over the edge of death, Ivy realized something she hadn't felt in months: she wasn't the only one still trying to survive. Later, as the fire settled into embers and her muscles began to ache from stillness, Ivy rose and pulled an extra blanket from the cabinet. She walked across the floor slowly, carefully, and knelt beside the bear. The heat of her body was faint but present. Ivy tucked the blanket gently over her side, not all the way, just enough to cover the worst of the wounds. She didn't say a word, but the bear opened one eye briefly, and for the first time blinked, not with pain, but with awareness. The bear wouldn't eat while Ivy was in the room. She had warmed broth, shredded venison, even added a bit of apple, something she remembered a rehab center once using for rescued cubs. But each time Ivy set the bowl down and stepped back, the bear only watched, not hostile, not panicked, just still. Her eyes followed Ivy with quiet, unreadable weight, as if waiting for something to go wrong. Ivy tried to keep her movements soft. No loud sounds, no direct approach. She spoke gently each time she entered, narrating what she was doing like it might make a difference. Just changing the water, she'd say, crouching low. No surprises, I promise. The bear never moved, but Ivy noticed how her muscles tensed when she got too close, how her breathing changed. This wasn't instinct. It was memory. So Ivy began leaving the food and stepping out of sight, just enough time for the broth to cool, for the silence to settle. Sometimes she'd wait by the porch steps pretending not to listen but always hoping. On the third day, she heard the scrape of the bowl across the floor. That night Ivy didn't sit by the fire. She sat on the opposite end of the room, far enough away to mean nothing, close enough to be present. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She just sat while the bear ate, slowly, deliberately, watching her between bites, not with fear now, but with something else, caution, curiosity. The bear didn't finish the food, but she left the bowl half empty. That was enough. Later, when the fire was low and the shadows long, Ivy sat with a notebook in her lap. The bear rested across the room again, eyes open but calm. Ivy studied the curve of her body, the old scars, half-healed along her side, the ear tags still dull in the firelight. You need a name, she said quietly. Something that's yours, not theirs. The bear didn't respond, but her ears twitched. Ivy's voice softened. Hazel. She hadn't meant to say it, not out loud, but the name had been circling her thoughts since the first night, gentle, grounded, something pulled from earth and color and stubborn roots. She didn't know why, not exactly. Only that it fit. Hazel, she repeated. If it's all right with you. The bear blinked once, slow and heavy, then lowered her head onto the blanket. It wasn't consent, not really, but it wasn't rejection either. From that moment, Ivy stopped calling her the bear in her thoughts. She was Hazel now. Hazel, who flinched when touched but never growled. Hazel, who ate only when Ivy wasn't looking but stayed close to the fire. Hazel, who had survived something she couldn't yet speak. The bond wasn't built in a single moment. It grew between breaths, in pauses and patience. But something had shifted, and Ivy felt it settle in her chest like the first steady beat of something long buried, trust. It started with the silence, not the soft, settling kind that Ivy had grown used to, the kind that wrapped around the cabin like a blanket. This was different, sharper, hollow in places it hadn't been before. The birds had gone quiet. The squirrels no longer darted across the back clearing. Even the wind, so constant through the pines, had stilled. Hazel noticed it too. She had grown stronger in the days since Ivy named her. She moved more often now, shifting from one side of the fire to the other, drinking water without hesitation, sometimes even standing to stretch before curling back down again. And she had started eating while Ivy sat nearby, slowly, yes, but openly. It wasn't affection, not yet, but it was something that felt like trust. But that morning, Hazel didn't eat. She stood instead, shoulders tight, body angled toward the window like she was listening to something Ivy couldn't hear. Her ears twitched, her nose lifted, catching something in the breeze. Ivy followed her gaze outside. Nothing moved, but Ivy's stomach dropped all the same. She stepped onto the porch just after noon. The trail looked the same, the trees, the air, the fading orange light on the ridge, but the feeling lingered that someone or something had passed through. It wasn't until she turned back to the door that she saw it, folded cloth, pale, ragged around the edges, left under the corner of the porch. Rat, so subtle Ivy nearly missed it. She crouched, heart already pounding, and lifted it. Clipped to the fabric was a thin metal tag, not unlike Hazel's ear marker, but this one had no identification, no wildlife code, only a single line scratched deep into the surface. Better not to dig too deep. Her fingers curled around the metal until her knuckles whitened. It wasn't a threat, not exactly. It was a warning, the kind people delivered with a smile and a silence too practiced to be casual. Ivy stood slowly, scanning the treeline, no tire tracks, no footprints. Whoever left it hadn't come by accident and hadn't wanted to be seen. Back inside, Hazel was standing again, posture stiff, eyes locked on the door. Ivy met her gaze and nodded. They knew. She didn't need to explain who they were. Hazel had lived in their hands. She wore their tag like a scar, and now they'd come to see if she was still alive. That night, Ivy kept the fire low and the lights off. She sat near the back window, a flashlight in one hand, the emergency radio charging beside her. Hazel didn't sleep. She lay near the hearth, body tense, ears turned toward every creak in the cabin frame. The forest no longer felt like home. It felt like a line had been crossed, and something was waiting on the other side. Ivy didn't sleep that night, not even in shifts. She sat by the back window with a mug of cold coffee and the metal tag laid flat on the table beside her. Hazel had curled near the fire again, not resting, not truly. Her breathing was even, but her eyes remained half open, tracking every movement Ivy made. Each gust of wind sent her ears twitching. Each distant crack from the woods made her head lift. Outside, the forest was holding its breath. At dawn, the first frost painted the windows in spiderwebs of ice. Ivy stood slowly, rolled her shoulders, and went straight to the desk. She opened her laptop, connected the satellite receiver, and waited for the blinking light to steady. Her fingers hovered for a moment over the keyboard, then settled into motion. She uploaded the photo of Hazel's ear tag, then the bruises, angled, precise, unmistakably human. The third image was harder, it was Hazel's face, tired, wary, alive. Ivy wrote the message slowly, carefully. This animal was discarded, not by nature, but by people. This is not a rogue bear. This is a survivor of something hidden, and I'm not going to let her story be buried. She sent it to 5 contacts, 2 journalists, 1 conservation organization, a wildlife vet she had met during an aid mission in Laos, and a friend from her last deployment. Someone she had pulled from a collapsed bunker who had once said, "If you ever need to disappear or go loud, call me first." Then she began compiling her own report, not a diary, not a blog post, but a document, factual, time-stamped, with photographs, medical notes, scanned pages from the wildlife tracking book showing Hazel's tag wasn't registered with any federal or non-profit conservation database. Every piece of evidence pointed to a private operation using bears like Hazel for something that had nothing to do with science. She wrote until her hands ached. She burned 2 encrypted flash drives with the full folder and hid one beneath the floorboards under the bed. The second she sealed in a weatherproof envelope and addressed to the P.O. box in Montana her friend had access to. Hazel watched her the whole time. When Ivy finally turned toward her again, the bear was standing, not fully upright, but enough to shift her weight forward, ears forward, muscles tight beneath her thickening fur. Her eyes locked on Ivy's hand on the tag still resting on the table. She let out a low chest-deep sound, not a growl, not fear, recognition. Ivy froze. Her fingers hovered over the tag. "You remember who gave it to you?" she whispered. Hazel blinked once, then turned her head slowly toward the door. Her body didn't move, but her gaze said everything. They were coming. That evening, Ivy began reinforcing the cabin. She closed the shutter she hadn't touched in 2 years, cut lengths of wood to brace the inner doors, charged every battery-powered light she owned, and tested her backup generator. She prepped ration packs, checked the rifle she hadn't used since training, and swept the trail behind her cabin for signs of movement. There were none, but that only made her more certain. She could feel it like the hum before a storm. That night, she sat beside Hazel for a long time, stroking the edge of her fur slow and steady. "They won't get you back," she said, voice low. Hazel didn't move, but her eyes closed. The cabin was warmer than it had been in days. The fire crackled in the hearth. A storm was settling in outside, the kind with snow that layered quiet over everything. But Ivy no longer saw the trees as peaceful. She saw them as cover, concealment, a way in for people who didn't knock, who didn't speak, who didn't need permission. But she also saw something else. If she couldn't stop them with force, she would stop them with exposure. If they came, she would not run. Because this wasn't about survival anymore. It was about truth, and Hazel deserved to be more than a secret. The snow began to fall just after midnight. It was slow at first, a soft dusting across the windowsills, whispering against the tin roof. By morning, it was thick and steady, muffling the world in a blanket of white. Ivy stood at the window, mug clutched in both hands, watching the forest blur into haze. The cabin was still. Hazel lay near the hearth, breath calm but shallow, her belly rising with a new kind of weight. She was close, days, maybe hours. Ivy could feel it in the way she moved, in the quiet groans when she shifted, in the stillness she carried like instinct. Ivy turned from the window and crossed the room to check the door. That was when she saw it, a shadow across the snow. Not the wind. Not a deer. A shape, tall, human, moving slowly along the trail, then stopping just beyond the porch. Ivy's heart dropped into her stomach. She moved fast but silent, ducked low beside the window frame, and peeked through the edge of the curtain. There was a man standing in the snow. No hood, no coat. Just a black fleece jacket dusted white across the shoulders. Hands exposed to the cold. He wasn't armed. He wasn't moving. He was just standing, watching the door. Hazel stirred behind her. Ivy turned, and the bear was up. Not fully standing, but upright enough to shift her weight. Ears forward. Eyes locked, not with fear, but with memory. Ivy rose, crossed to the door and opened it halfway, leaving the latch hooked. The man didn't flinch. "You're Ivy," he said. His voice was calm. "Too calm," she said, "nothing more." "I'm not here to take her," he added. "I just needed to see if she was still alive." That was worse. Ivy tightened her grip on the doorframe. "Who are you?" "My name's Nathan." A pause, then with quiet clarity, "I used to work at the farm." The words hit harder than she expected. He looked older than his voice, worn, pale eyes lined by something deeper than age. He wasn't shaking from the cold. "I know what they did," he said. "I walked out when I saw what they were planning." He thought. He stopped, shook his head. "I thought she'd already been killed." "She wasn't," Ivy said, her voice firm now. "But you knew that when you sent the tag." Nathan's eyes widened slightly. I didn't send it. Ivy's pulse skipped. I got your message, he continued. The one you sent out. They saw it too. I came before they did. Silence filled the space between them. Ivy's breath fogged the air. She's close, Nathan said, nodding toward the door. You should know the others. If they find her, and they know she's bred naturally, they won't just try to recover her. They'll erase everything. Her. The cubs? You. Ivy. Ivy didn't blink. Then why are you here? Nathan looked at the cabin, at the snow, at the faint trail that led back into the trees. Because I owed her that much. He stepped back. No further explanation, no apology, and then he was gone. Not into the trees, but into the silence. Inside, Hazel hadn't moved, but her whole body trembled, not from cold, but from knowing. The wind died. By nightfall, the forest, blanketed in snow, exhaled a hush that stretched for miles. Ivy stood at the back window, eyes fixed on the dark trail Nathan had vanished down, half expecting to see him again. But there was no movement. Only the trees, heavy with white, standing still in the cold. She hadn't told him to leave. She hadn't needed to. Something in his voice made it clear he wasn't here to interfere. He had come to acknowledge a life that shouldn't have survived, and then disappear before someone came who wouldn't knock. Inside the cabin, the fire cast long, low shadows across the walls. Hazel hadn't moved since Nathan left. She lay near the hearth, her eyes open, fixed on nothing, but her body was restless now, small shifts, quiet groans, the flick of her ears. Her breathing had changed. Ivy knelt beside her. It's time, isn't it? Hazel blinked once. There were no cub boxes, no birthing pens, just the thick wool blankets Ivy had prepared in the corner by the fireplace, tucked low with clean towels and lined with old canvas sacks she'd softened in warm water. She'd researched everything, old wildlife manuals, veterinary field guides, whispered advice from a conservationist over a scrambled signal, but nothing could prepare her for what came next. Hazel shifted slowly toward the corner, dragging herself across the floor with quiet determination. Ivy didn't help, she knew better than to interfere. This wasn't a moment for hands or tools. It was a moment of instinct, of trust. She watched from a distance, breath held, hands clenched around a towel she never used. It began just after midnight. No screams, no roars, just low, guttural sounds, deep and ancient and steady. Hazel's body tensed in rhythmic waves, her sides heaving with the force of nature. She pushed through pain, and through it all her eyes never left Ivy, even as she labored, even as her body broke and rebuilt itself with every contraction. She watched, and Ivy stayed for hours, through the first whimpering gasp of breath, through the tiny squirming shapes that emerged, wet and blinking and impossibly alive. One, then another, then two more, four. And all, Hazel licked each one clean with slow, patient movements, her body sagging with exhaustion but never once turning away. The cubs clung to her belly, eyes shut, breath fast, tiny paws twitching in the warm cave of their mother's fur. Ivy felt something collapse in her body, not fear, not even relief, something older, something like reverence. She had seen life take form in the worst places, in field tents stained with smoke, in sand and concrete ruins where mothers whispered to children they couldn't protect. But this was different. This was not born from survival, it was born from defiance. Hazel, once discarded, once marked for silence, had done the one thing they never thought she could, she had created something free. Ivy didn't speak. She didn't move. She only watched as the cabin filled with the soft sounds of breath and warmth and new beginnings. Hazel lifted her head for the first time. She looked not through Ivy but into her, and in her eyes was something Ivy hadn't seen in any creature in a long, long time: peace. Spring came slowly, then all at once. The snow melted into soil, the wind carried birdsong again, and the forest exhaled like something long held had finally been released. Ivy stood on the porch each morning, watching the mist roll through the trees, a mug warm in her hands. But now, when Hazel emerged into the doorway behind her, it wasn't in fear, it was in vigilance. Hazel no longer watched the woods to see what might come, she watched to ensure nothing would. Inside, the cabin was no longer silent, it pulsed with life. For cubs scrambled clumsily over blankets and paws, squealing and snorting, nipping playfully at Hazel's ears. Ivy laughed for the first time in months, real, full laughter, the kind that rises up from somewhere untouched by pain. But peace never lasts in hiding. The footage Ivy had sent weeks before had found the right eyes. One morning, her encrypted line lit up with a single message: "We got them." The bear farm, the one Hazel had escaped. Ambushed at dawn, crates broken open, wounded bears transported under protection, names she would never know, but lives freed because of one bear who refused to die quietly. Hazel's story had sparked a reckoning. Ivy reached out to a wildlife rehabilitation center 3 states over, one she trusted. They had the land, the specialists, the space for a family of 5 to recover and eventually return to where they belonged. Hazel would not grow old behind bars, neither would her cubs. The day came faster than Ivy was ready for. The transport team arrived just after dawn, quiet and respectful. Hazel walked into the crate without force, calm, measured, as if she knew this wasn't an ending but a return. The cubs followed clumsily and curious, tumbling inside with wide eyes and tiny roars. Ivy placed her hand on the side of the crate. She said, "I wouldn't let them take you," she whispered, "but it turns out letting go can be another kind of protection." Hazel turned her head, met Ivy's eyes. No sound, no cry, just recognition. 3 months later, Ivy drove up to the rehabilitation grounds. The air smelled of pine and thawing earth. A guide met her at the gates and took her quietly through the forest to a clearing where 5 figures waited at the edge of the trees. Hazel stood taller now, her fur was fuller, her body strong. Beside her, the cubs played, older, sharper, wild already in the way they moved. Ivy didn't speak, she didn't need to. Hazel turned once more, just briefly, one final look. Ivy felt the tear slip down her cheek, but it didn't hurt, it healed. She lifted a hand. "Welcome home," she said softly. Hazel didn't look back again because she didn't have